There used to be an assumption that if you had a large population, that your civilization was probably more prepared for the future than others. But this seems to have not been the case in history. Places like India and China took a long time before they started becoming technologically supreme compared to other places in our modern world. But if we go back in time, these two places were not only masters of their population, but they are probably two of the best examples of what can happen when you track your population and when you utilize them in the best way possible. They were so good at this that they knew how to calculate other people's populations. Even when an official census was not given, they could tell through taxes, tax information, and others good estimates for what the populations would be. There were around about 150 million people in the Ming Dynasty, which is a very large number considering the rest of the world. But to be fair, China is a relatively large country compared to the rest of the world, and it is on the biggest continent in the world, which is Asia. If we compare these numbers to, let's say, South Africa, a African country with a sizable population, I mean, even today, the numbers have nowhere near the numbers of the Ming Dynasty. There's about 50 million people in South Africa now, 60, but that number is nothing compared to the 150, which is the low part that could have existed during the Ming Dynasty, and 60 million households calculated. And South Africa is a large country. Now, of course, we must take into context that there were the smallpox epidemics that happened in Western Cape, or that area full of Khoisan people, and it got rid of millions of people at that time. But by 1800, the number of people in South Africa that were calculated was about 2 to 3 million people, with around 30,000 white people in the country. Within 1850, there was about 200,000 white people in South Africa. And within the 1900s, there was about 8 million Black South Africans. Now, those numbers might not be fully accurate, but they are very close to the real numbers. So if we compare them to obviously the Ming Dynasty, we have historians like Dong Tzu Chu, who used various methods, didn't just take the numbers given by the Ming Dynasty, but took various methods to cross reference these numbers. And even if they're incorrect about the exact numbers, it's somewhere in those numbers. And he used things like the banknotes, which I'm presenting over here. He used tax collection. He used average household number that is being gathered by historians. And they get somewhere up there in the hundreds of millions of people. So, of course, the question is it true that it takes a large population for you to be technologically extreme or technologically supreme the way that the Chinese were during the Ming era? So you're probably wondering what I mean when I say that the people of China could also calculate other people's populations, including Indonesia, the Swahili coast, and places as far as Europe. These would be made based on the guesses by checking how many marketing goods were in demand in those countries. While that information is pretty good, it does not give you fully accurate things because, of course, there's such a thing as multiple purchases for rich people, although they try to check for this type of information. If we look further into people who stayed for a pretty long time inside of these areas, they give roughly the same amount of numbers. And in fact, they sort of confirm this idea or theory that they had, that they could at least guess the populations by guessing how many people demanded things, especially those that are individual. And of course, estimating from stereotyping what type of lifestyle was reported about these people. Pure mathematics does not help either in calculating people. So let's go directly to Africa and try to guess how many people lived in specific regions. And this is done not just so that we can have a number in our hand, but also to estimate the difference between the number of people who lived in poverty versus the number of people who lived in abundance in these areas. Because we are told by many people, Duarte Lopez is an example, um, Barbosa is another one, and so many more, Alfred Dapper, that a lot of these people had very few people, tens of thousands of people that were poor. But Africa is different because they had millions and millions of people. Having 20,000 people starve is relatively small compared to those millions. Something that also makes it difficult to calculate the population within Africa, although there are places that have a census, but we'll get to that, is the fact that they had polygamy. And so for every male, you would have 4 or 5 different females, depending on the wealth of the individual, and they would have children as young as 15, giving birth. So you have 15-year-olds giving birth with the chance of, a failed childbirth thing that was very typical back then. But again, you have 4 others who are in similar time going to give birth as well. And then within 15 years, you have more and more and more. This will result in millions. Now, the highest estimations that we could go is just taking the raw numbers that are given to us by the people who are actually there. If we obviously go in the Swahili coast, we have far more information than we do in places like Congo. If we read this part from Duarte Lopez, or at least a extraction from Duarte Lopez, we will see that there are about 1 million people in the army of the Kingdom of Angola, 1 million grown men. And this is not the entire population. It is not like the Zulu Kingdom where every man who could fight in the war fought in the war. Instead, these were regiments of people. And this is also the same in the Kingdom of Monimadapa, where not everyone is a warrior, but they do have these extremely large, reaching millions of people fighting in the army. And this will give us an indicator of how large these populations were. If we read, the Kingdom of Angola is populated to an incredible extent, the men taking as many wives as they wish, and the people multiplying without end, which is not the case in the Congo, for there they live as Christians, so that, as Duarte Lopez said and believed, the Kingdom of Angola has nearly 1 million fighting men, for every man having many wives. So also many sons are born to them, and all go willingly to battle in the service of their prince. The country is peculiarly rich in mines of silver and copper. There is a greater abundance of various metals than in any other country in the world. It also abounds in all manner of produce, has various animals, and peculiarly herds of cows. Now, that might seem like a decent number of people, but estimations of the Kingdom of Angola says there was about 5 million people who lived in that population, which obviously you can guess from that number that that means they had a lot of warriors. Still not the majority of the population, but that's a lot of people. Although the country of Angola is named after Angola, this still does not make the full country the Angola Empire. And in fact, there was about 12 kingdoms that existed at the same time in that area, including the Kingdom of Congo. Putting all those together, We're not going to go through every single one. We get about 12 million people living in the country of Angola in the 1500s. In the Kingdom of Congo, the estimations go from 3 million to about 5 million in 1490. So, in other words, we're looking at just when the Portuguese had just arrived. And in later years, the population didn't grow as fast as the Kingdom of Angola, as mentioned, because polygamy was sort of looked down upon. It didn't disappear, but it was looked down on. Uniting these numbers, we get from Congo and Angola about 10 million people. These are two giant countries together, only coming up with a small number of people. Now, think about how easy it would have been to maintain these people, especially given the extreme wealth in those nations. Now, some people say the population would have expanded anyway, but the populations were expanding to the knowledge of the kings of those kingdoms. They were not broken into smaller areas, and people were responsible for the size collapse and size shrinkage. With the entrance of the Portuguese and people like that, some of these numbers became very difficult to calculate. For example, the amount of people who moved away from the coasts because of the slave raids, and then, of course, slavery taking a lot of the population, changing the balance, because usually populations should have about 50-50 men and women, roughly. But things change dramatically when this happens. As large as the population of Ethiopia is, it still does not compare to some of the other places inside of Africa. For example, West Africa had millions and millions of people. Now, what is interesting about the Swahili coast, on the other hand, is that on the concentrated sides of the Swahili coast, or what you would call the Swahili coast proper, the numbers never really exceeded a couple thousand. So if we take Kilwa, for example, there was about 20,000 people living in Kilwa. If we take Lamu, again, we're talking about 12,000 people. If we take, now there's tons of them, and they eventually make up 1 million, 2 million, perhaps. But then if you go further inland from the Swahili coast, you start getting higher and higher numbers, to the point that Al Masudi said that they outnumber the Abyssinians if you count everybody. The only reason why I think it's important to put populations into context is because in our heads, we might have this super large population. I mean, millions and millions of people in some cases, but a lot of the time it's not that simple. And you look at the Swahili coast and you compare it to Angola or the Kingdom of Congo, you can easily see the difference. But technologically, there are things that the Swahili coast had that are worlds apart from what the people had in Angola and any of those other regions, really. But of course, that is not the secret ingredient, which is having a much smaller population that is more concentrated, and more concentrated meaning fixed as a population. Because obviously, we have West Africa where they have inventions that didn't exist in other parts of the world until later. I mean, like stamps, for example, these wooden stamps that exist in West Africa, you don't find them anywhere else in Africa until later dates. I want to start talking about the technologies that the Africans developed themselves, but in order to do this, I need a little bit of time. I'm going to release a video about a certain type of cotton technique used in Africa later. But the main reason why this is so difficult is because you have to find specific people who mention seeing these inventions in those areas. That's the hard part. Painting a picture of what things should be in specific areas is very difficult. And so, of course, if we take places like West Africa or Central West Africa, so Equatorial Africa, we get a much different view when it comes to population because those populations are always moving. That's the part where it gets more and more difficult to know what number of people lived because they never stayed in one area in one lifetime, at least not all of them. Although we do have numbers that come from the Gegrim, and we do have numbers that come from Middle Eastern scholars at the time and Egyptian scholars of West African populations, a lot of these are not direct accounts. So, in other words, it's someone who lived very far away from these places and they mix up areas. And so they say when they're in Kano, they say we're in Kano, when in actual fact they're really somewhere else. And when they say that they saw this population, a lot of the time that population will be dismissed as a fake population, but it might be real, but we cannot locate necessarily who those people are. We know that through the slave trade, millions of people were taken. So there must have been a very large population in those areas. And of course, we have other populations of Africans that live all over West Africa who themselves gave us a rough estimate in things like, of course, Timbuktu books and stuff like that. But again, these estimates are not good enough. My only point is to show that actually some of the places that we see and the estimations that we have about these places are very different when you squeeze a specific type of information. For example, how many people lived in that area? How many of them were involved in war? Would you really invest in something like military grade weapons of that time, like armor and stuff, for 20,000 people? And would you, if you lived in Angola, knowing how big your population is, build something like armor? And why didn't they build armor in those areas? I mean, we know that Africans built all kinds of things with metals, some metals that didn't even exist in Europe and Asia. So why didn't they build armor? Maybe even small armor in the case of like a circle in on the chest just to protect you from that. Another focus would be population wise, how many people actually left Africa voluntarily, which, I'm still trying to figure that out, which is actually tens of thousands of people, which is very different than exploration. And I don't mean leave and then come back, I mean just leave. These questions we will explore in the future. Again, I want to make a video on the technology of cotton and why it's still an important thing beyond the information I've already told you on my channel before, because it's tied to so many other different forms of technology. And even in the later years, it would be tied to things like the printing press. That will be my only clue that I'll give.